Welcome back to the second half of my talk, looking at Swiss art, Swiss connections between 1889 and 1940. We're going to go back to the beginning of the century and looking at one of Paul Klee's inventions from 1903. This is plate 9 and it's called The Virgin in the Tree. Now, there's very little that he has said about these images, and my theory is that aside from the more general business of kind of kicking against academia, breaking away from the idea of sort of conventional beauty and sort of breaking into ugliness, into things that are conventionally unattractive, I also suspect that there's a little bit of a Mickey tape going on, and perhaps he was also trying to shake off the massive presence of Ferdinand Hodler, who was a kind of dominant, great artist in Switzerland at that time. The figure in the middle, which is Hodler's mistress, she's quite skinny, and maybe Klee had the idea of exaggerating it, making it more kind of caricaturish in that etching. And then there's this one also from the same series, and this is called Two Men Meeting Each Other and each supposing the other to be of a higher rank. So this is another one it's in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So there's obviously a strong kind of satirical edge to his work. I think Klee felt that he was a bit of an outsider. There were tensions, sort of aesthetically, I suppose, in his own mind. He was a very gifted musician, played the violin, and there was a bit of which route should he follow? Should he become a musician, or should he move into the fine arts? And of course, that's what he chose to do. His training, his art school training, wasn't madly happy. He was in Munich, the art school there, but again, things weren't entirely smooth for him. I think he had a different kind of mindset, and he was not one who was looking to sort of follow in the grand traditions. And another interesting one called Comic Actor, where we have a figure with a mask. So the mask, obviously, has got a bit more of a smile on it than the figure behind. In fact, the figure behind has got definitely a rather sinister looking eye. And this is called Woman and Beast, another etching of his. And I think this one, maybe despite the tendency to kind of move away from tradition, it could easily be seen as part of perhaps a late example of symbolist work. Again, that curious, rather shapeless movement, producing images that are full of allusions. They kind of nudge the viewer to make their own associations with what's going on in the pictures. Obviously, one of the great theorists and proponents of symbolism was the French poet Mallarmé, who didn't want to address things directly, but kind of allude to them. So we always have this idea of kind of making an image arise in the reader's consciousness. Now, obviously, when you're dealing with imagery, that's a different thing, but you can still suggest things which are perhaps outside of the range of the immediately visual, or maybe make an association with something perhaps that couldn't or shouldn't be said directly. And this is the last one of these etchings that I'm going to show, and this is called Menacing Head. Now, one of the things, again, puzzles about where Klee's ideas came from, and how his kind of vision evolved. We don't really know at what point he discovered the art of the insane. We do know that many years later, I mean, this etching that we're looking at here dates from 1905, and it would be 15 years before he actually went to visit the Prinzhorn collection in Germany, which was one of the first psychiatric institutes to open up its doors and show work to the public by the inmates. Klee and Oskar Schlemmer visited it 2 years before it became better known, when Prinzhorn himself published his book on the artistry of the mentally ill. Now, it's probable that he did know something about this, because in Switzerland itself they were quite enlightened in the way in which psychiatric patients were treated, and probably the most famous institute was the Waldo Institute, and we will see some works a bit later on by the most famous inmate of that place. So, looking beyond the edges of the tradition, I mean, obviously Klee is like a number of artists who are doing this at about this time. I mean, if we think of this painting, this etching being done in 1905, 2 years before Picasso did his Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, in which he was looking again beyond the grand tradition of European art for his sources. Now, it's perhaps at a slightly more prosaic beginning. This is a little painting of Klee's, painted on glass, and it's painted in the sort of traditional method of painting on the reverse of the glass. So all the detail goes in first, and then you gradually work your way back to the background colours. Now, this is something that folk artists used, and both Kandinsky and Gabriel Munter in Munich produced paintings on glass, but theirs were closer really to the Bavarian tradition of icon painting. This one strikes me as owing something to Japanese picture making. And now we come to one of the most famous of the l'art brut artists. Now, the term l'art brut was coined much later by Jean de Buffet in the 1940s, but and he was one of the first people to put together collections of their work kind of outside of sort of conventional psychiatric institutes or museums. He formed a thing called La Compagnie de l'Art Brut, but that now is a museum in Lausanne. Now, this particular artist, whose name is Heinrich Anton Müller, came from a sort of peasant stock, and we're not quite sure where he was born, but he was born in 1869, and while still a young man and working in the vineyards, he apparently invented, again we can't be absolutely sure how true these stories are, but he certainly claimed to have invented a machine that would pick the grapes. And then the story continues that somebody stole the rights to this machine, and then this kind of turned his mind, and he became, well, insane. He became, he had to be institutionalized and spent much of the rest of his, well, in fact, the whole of the rest of his life in an institute. But again, it was a place in which the doctors were enlightened, humane, and looked after him and allowed him to produce work. Much of it done in coloured pencil, and this one, again, probably not his title, as it's just a descriptive name, Man with Flies and Snake. And this was made only a few years before he died. He died in the 1930s. This was done around about 1925, 27, and it's coloured pencil on drawing paper. And here is another one of his, which is the title you can see written in beautiful copperplate writing on the back of this strange pig on the right hand side. My pig is called Rafi. And this one is undated. I'm not quite sure when it was produced. And another one, and this is a mixture of watercolor, crayon and pencil. Now this work, obviously we can view it as being something that is a kind of strange little side alley to the history of art, but I think that would be a mistake. I mean, perhaps it began in a side alley, but many artists, and the surrealists in particular, were greatly inspired and excited by these works, and of course coupled with another one of the surrealists' heroes, Arthur Rimbaud, who talked about cultivating a thorough derangement of the senses. These La Brute images fit very well into that train of thought. And here we have Heinrich Anton Müller with one of his crazy machines that he made while he was an inmate. Again, obviously completely useless machine, although a wonderful looking thing, and as far as I know, it no longer exists, which is a shame. It's a terrific looking thing. In fact, it's kind of sort of reminiscent of almost of something like one of Eva Hesse's pieces. And now we come to an artist that one of my tutors, Ian Breakwell, when I was a student on my foundation course, he claimed that Adolf Wulfli, that's the name of this artist, was one of the 20th century's greatest artists. And this is a collage and drawing called Returning from Siberia, made in 1905. Now, at the age of 15, Wulfli was arrested for sexually assaulting a small girl, and he then spent the rest of his life in a mental asylum in Valda. He was fortunate in that he was looked after very well and was allowed to work and to produce masses and masses of drawings. He wrote music, decorated furniture, and was given within the confines of this place a remarkable amount of creative freedom. And I'll now read a piece by him, his testament. In the name of both above mentioned and below signed, in future, almighty reigning instances, the Holy Saint Adolf, great God and author of the book, as well as the Holy Saint Mary, great goddess, all musical and geographical, 13 books piled up in this hospital cell and, made by myself, should be printed at an excellent Swiss printing workshop, altogether a total of 16,500 million copies, 4 volumes, and be bound nice and elegant at a ditto bookbinder with the simple and excellent title, The Holy Saint Adolf II, and then at the selling price per individual copy at 16 francs 50 rappen, in retail, wholesale and world trade, each be presented to the purchaser. The fixed income of all these volumes would then be, altogether, about 250 million francs, of which circa about 25,000 million francs would fall to the share of book printer, bookbinder and transport costs. The fixed, absolute net profit of this printing result would then be altogether 252,250 million francs, of which I above mentioned and below signed to the High Swiss Federal Council about 2,000 million francs in most legal and most excellent information do testamentarily bequeath for the respective use of building, formation and excellent repair of different generally useful and charitable foundations and their excellent financing, etc. Not only in the canton of Bern, no, in all individually highly special Swiss cantons, as well as the odd 250 million francs for the excellent distribution amongst the poor, sick and needy, each of my beloved Swiss country. Respectfully signs, greets and concludes my humble self, Saint Adolf II, great God, Bern, 1916. And this one has the rather more prosaic title of South London, drawn in 1911. And you can see inside these kind of little mandala circular forms, there's musical notation. And sort of in the 70s, people did actually perform some of his musical pieces. It's a shame that he never got to hear them. And this is called Second Folio March from 1913. And this one has got a lot more in the way of musical notation and also his love of millions and millions and millions. You can see here, starts off 15 and then goes round and round and round. So we've got this kind of infinite thing, which actually reminds me of a terrible nightmare I used to have as a child, but I won't go into that now. And the next image I have is a crucifixion, the crucifixion of the Holy Saint Adolf. Pencil and coloured pencil on newsprint. So you can see at the bottom here, presumably this is Saint Adolf himself. Wulfli considered himself the persecuted, but given his conditions and the allowance that he had to produce all this stuff, maybe life wasn't so awful for him. And he also produced collages, cut up magazines and made these marvelous pieces of design and terrific colour. I mean, look at that as a colour composition. Absolutely beautiful. This one, I don't think he gave it a title. It's just known as Packard after the advert. And this is from 1927. So this is getting towards the end of his life. He died in 1930. And another one untitled, known as Overmaltine. Again, interesting range of images, and on the sort of right-hand side, it looks as if he's taken some children's book illustration and put it into the thing. And then up here is one of his characteristic sort of masked faces. In this case, it looks as if it's the sun. And this is a piece by another artist who also spent the end of his life in an institution. This is Louis Adolphe Soutet, and he was a distant cousin of Le Corbusier. He was obviously quite a sensitive and perhaps psychologically unstable individual. He had some art training. He studied architecture in Paris, and he also had a strong interest in medieval art. In 1903, he divorced and returned to Switzerland, and his health really deteriorated from then on, both physically and mentally. And from 1906, he was in and out of institutions. Many years later, by 1923, he was then admitted sort of more or less permanently into a psychiatric institution. And 4 years later, his cousin, Le Corbusier, met him for the first time and began to help him financially, and also noted his work. And in fact, he then took a group of his pictures to the United States, and he had an exhibition at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in 1936. But apparently the exhibition had no echoes, nothing really came of it, apart from being noticed by the surrealists and a rather handsome article printed in their glossy magazine, The Minotaur. And in 1942, he died in an old people's home. So a rather sort of sad life, but he's an artist who's worth looking up, and he did a lot of these kind of very strong and strange pen and ink drawings, and he also did a number of finger paintings as well, which also have a very powerful kind of psychic presence. And now for something very different. This is François-Émile Barrault, and he is an artist who is very much kind of in parallel with a movement in Germany known as Neusacklichkeit, the new objectivity. And Neusacklichkeit was a kind of reaction really to expressionism. A lot of people considered that the expressionists were terribly self-indulgent, and that more power, more profundity perhaps could be had by a more restrained approach, and maybe playing with images, making the image more significant than the manner in which it's expressed. So Barrault was trained in Switzerland, and at the age of 20, he first showed it in a Swiss national exhibition in Basel. So he then, because of this success, he then went to Paris and studied works in the Louvre. And in 1924, he married a French woman, Marie. And but again, he was a man who also was rather physically weak, and he suffered from pulmonary disease and returned to Switzerland. And he had his first major exhibition in 1929 in La Chaux de Fonds. Now, the thing that perhaps characterizes his work is that it's, or much of it anyway, is that it's realistic, but it's kind of, there are things about it that make it not quite real. There are little quite subtle changes that he makes, or emphases that he makes, that give the painting kind of curious quality. I mean, I think this one is one of his most powerful paintings. The title of it is La Luronne, and I don't think there is a direct English translation of the word, but I suppose the closest would be, perhaps it would be wench. In other words, a kind of a hearty, strong young woman. So the thing that's interesting, at least to me, about this painting is the way in which he has manipulated the lighting. So you get this remarkable kind of dark back edge to her body, and then the wall getting light towards it. And then on the other side, where she's lit, presumably from this window, which we can't see, but it's also this kind of dark line running round it, which seems to be part of the wall. So there's a kind of curious, almost sense of the figure embedded in the space. So she's in the round, but there's also a curious kind of tension in it that perhaps makes us suspect there's a kind of flatness as well. This is a self-portrait. This one dates from 1931, so this is 3 years before he died. And by this time he'd been diagnosed with tuberculosis, so he did not have long to live. Again, a sort of beautiful, simple, but very cold painting. You almost kind of feel that the palette with the red on it says something about the state of his lungs. And the last one I'm going to show you is just simply called Fille au travail, girl working. And this one really strikes me as being a painting that doesn't have a subtext particularly. It's a painting that is just simply showing a young woman sweeping, washing the floor, doing something ordinary. And this was painted in 1933, the year before he died. And now, on a much lighter note, this is a very small painting. It's 8 1/4 inches high, and it's an oil painting on slate. And it was painted by Alberto Giacometti, and it's a painting of himself laughing. And he did this when he was 16, so 1917. So he of course, in a sense, couldn't avoid being an artist. His father and uncle were both artists, and it was all around. It was something that he grew up with. And this is a drawing in Chinese ink. This was done a year later, so when he was 17. Again, a bit bigger, 14 1/2 inches tall. And now we're getting on to adulthood. So this was done when he was 20, 1921, a self-portrait. And of course we can see here the strong influence of both his father, Giovanni Giacometti, and Kuno Amier, close friend of the Giacometti family. But also the other interesting thing to me about this, okay, the color is very kind of post-impressionist. moving perhaps towards what you might call fauvism, but there's also this very strong kind of geometric construction of the picture. You could almost sort of drop a Mondrian grid over it. And this is painted in 1923, which was when he then set off for Paris. Now this painting, to me, shows that he really sees things in the round. It's a very powerfully modelled painting, and he's using the paint in a very gutsy, full-blooded way. It's no surprise that he then became much more interested in sculpture. So arriving in Paris, one of the artists that he was strongly influenced by was Henri Laurens, who was one of the pioneers of Cubism, pioneer in the sense that he took it into sculpture. And this is obviously three views of the same piece by Giacometti, and it's just simply called Torso. So again, quite structural, reducing things to sort of simple blocks. And this obviously predates his meeting and joining with the Surrealists. Now this is one called Spoon Woman. This was made between 1926 and 1927, and this was a piece that André Breton, the leader of the Surrealists, admired, and by 1929 Giacometti was fully ensconced in the Surrealist movement. However, the relationship didn't last that many years before there was an argument, and quite a sort of significant argument, really. Breton apparently was irritated by the fact that Giacometti was constantly drawing heads, and apparently he said, everybody knows what a head looks like, and of course completely missing the point, at least the point that Giacometti was after, and that was Giacometti recognized that he didn't know what a head looked like, and every time he looked at a head he was looking at it anew. So, and really once he sort of shook off his connection with the Surrealists, what he was doing was dealing with perception and trying to work out how to get out there what he saw and what he felt about things that he was looking at. So the kind of myth-making and kind of elusive, suggestive work that he did with the Surrealists was left behind. Now, in 1932, a young woman called Merit Oppenheim, at the age of 18, went off to Paris, and one of the first, in fact, the first artist that she really became friends with was Alberto Giacometti. And this is a piece, as you can see on the left-hand side, remade in 1977 from a drawing that she made of Giacometti's ear. Now, Merit Oppenheim came from quite a cultured, well-to-do family with some very interesting connections. I mean, her father was a doctor, and he was a friend of Carl Jung, the great psychologist. And her grandmother, Merit Oppenheim's grandmother, was a feminist, and so Merit Oppenheim herself kind of grew up with the idea that that a woman could do as well and maybe better than a man. And going to Paris, she was going to sort of take on the world. Of course, she was admired by Man Ray, who took this photograph of her in Marcuse's printing studio, and she then became a kind of muse for the surrealists. Now, obviously, this is a kind of somewhat uncomfortable position to be in, and this is something that the surrealists have been kind of accused of treating women as sort of objects, or as something that inspired men but was not necessarily fully integrated into the sort of artistic community. I mean, I'm not sure how absolutely true that is, but we can argue about it. Anyway, by 1935, she was feeling the strain of all this, and went back to Switzerland for a little while and requested from her father that she should have a session with Carl Jung. And it might be interesting to hear the letter that Jung sent to her father after meeting her. Dear colleague, as you know, I saw your daughter in between. I do not think the case is too bad. She seems to have learned a lot from the clash with the elves. This is obviously a reference to the surrealists. And it is hard to see why this knowledge should not deepen considerably over time. And I do not have the impression that there is any neurotic complication, artistic temperament on the one hand, and the youthful disorientation of an age, which make up for the rationality of the 19th century muse, are well enough explanation for the unconventional nature of the point of view. I have the impression that the struggle with the realities in the natural intelligence of your daughter in a few years will bring a seriousness which makes hope for a sufficient adaptation to the power of reality. Yours sincerely, yours faithfully, C.G. Jung. So, that was interesting. And then we come to the object that is her most famous piece. And again, the story behind this is quite interesting. Oppenheim was inspired to create this piece, which she just simply called Object, during a chance encounter at a cafe. It began with a casual discussion. Pablo Picasso remarked upon the fur-covered bracelet Oppenheim was wearing, and the ensuing banter resulted in laughter at the irony that they could cover anything in fur. Later, at the request of André Breton to make an object for an upcoming exhibition, Oppenheim purchased a teacup, saucer and spoon at a local store and covered them in gazelle fur. As a result of her chance encounter with Picasso, characterized by frivolity and fun, Oppenheim's creation of a fur-covered teacup, saucer and spoon became one of the most famous of all surrealist objects. Breton changed the title of Oppenheim's object to Le Déjeuner en Fourrure, object, the luncheon in fur, as a reference to Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, purposefully implicating fetishism and sexual content that were not overtly implicated by the artist. When asked about Breton's changing the name of her work, she commented, "The word games of critics, the power struggles of men. Part of its scandalous appeal was not invented by me. It was a fluke." Yeah, well, I think that there's plenty of room for debate there. And perhaps she's being a little ingenuous in saying that, but who knows? Especially when she went on to produce things like this, My Governess. Yeah, I mean, talking of fetishism, and this, and these are all from the same year, so these are all produced spin-offs, if you like, from her first object. So this is just simply called fur gloves. Right, okay, now we're going to come to the last section of this, this talk, and we're going to be looking at Paul Klee. Now, Klee taught at the Bauhaus from 1921 to 1931. He was a form master in bookbinding, stained glass, and mural painting. And he had 2 studios there in which to work. I think his time there was fine, but I think towards the end of his tenure, he began to feel that it was all maybe a bit too kind of regimented, a bit too rational maybe, and so in 1931 he left and went to teach in Dusseldorf at the academy there. So, but of course, 1933 he was then singled out by a Nazi newspaper. Then that great fellow Klee comes onto the scene, already famed as a Bauhaus teacher in Dessau. He tells everyone he's a thoroughbred Arab, but he's a typical Galician Jew. His home was searched by the Gestapo and he was fired from his job. So this particular drawing is called The Fall. This was from 1933. And then followed it up with Struck from the List, also from 33. So, yes, this is obviously commemorating a very sad occasion. So in 33 and 34, he had exhibitions in London and Paris, and he finally met Picasso, whom greatly admired, and Picasso also liked his work and encouraged him. The family then emigrated back to Switzerland. Of course, it has to be said that even though Klee was born in Switzerland, he was not a Swiss citizen. His mother was Swiss, but his father was German, so he didn't automatically get Swiss citizenship. So he applied for Swiss citizenship, which was granted to him a couple of days after he died in 1940. So in 33, he produced about 500 works, but he began to experience the symptoms of what was diagnosed as scleroderma. But this disease wasn't actually diagnosed until after he died. And basically the experience was that his internal organs and skin became tight, grew hard, and made things like swallowing very difficult. So his output in 1936 was only 25 pictures. But later his health recovered somewhat, and he then was encouraged by a visit from Kandinsky and Picasso, and Klee then continued to produce work, and in fact in 1939 he produced 1,200 works, which was more than he'd ever produced in any year. Now this one was made in 1935 and is called Walpurgis Night. Again, obviously another one. I'm thinking about kind of devils and things, kind of sinister happenings. I guess perhaps it's Klee's equivalent of Max Ernst's painting of the Horde. And this painting is called Voice from the Ether. And you'll get enough to eat. So obviously this is something to do with perhaps the radio, listening to the radio, getting news that way. This is a tempera and oil on brown wrapping paper. Now his later work, again perhaps because he wasn't physically so capable as he had been, the work tends to be less fine, not so much fine detail. He's using kind of stronger and bigger marks, but he'd always worked on a relatively small scale. So I mean, this one is, in its biggest dimension, is 19 5/8 inches. So it's, yeah, it's like kind of large sketchbook size. And this one is called Outbreak of Fear from 1939. Again, it needs no further explanation. I mean, one of the things that intrigues me about it is that it's very similar in colour and in imagery to work that Billy Baumeister was doing in Germany, another artist who was sacked from his teaching job by the Nazis, but he went into what's generally referred to as internal exile. In other words, he kept his head down. And this is the last slide of the show, and this is Paul Klee's last still life, painted in 1940. And I thought this would be a nice one to end on, in that it's not entirely without some kind of glimmer of potential life. Obviously there's a dark background, things are happening against a dark background, but maybe this image at the top is some kind of fetus, perhaps, suggesting new life is possible. And there we have it. That is a cross-section of art in Switzerland from 1889 to 1940. Thank you for listening.